This is what she meant. Like, just put it in and we'll throw it out when we leave.
Unless she just gives one. Okay.
Okay, just
These are more like German operation. And then it'll. You can feel the R. See, they are meant by artists.
I see what you're saying. I don't think this was first.
Next one is, what is considered disrespectful in your culture?
Disrespectful. Everything that you don't, I just, like when you don't treat women right way, when you don't treat kids right way, this is something.
Next one is, what is the best thing about living here in America?
For me, living in the United States is a great experience because this country is very open, very democratic, and it's not corrupt, and it's a beautiful country. I love it. And this is like a paradise for me.
And how long have you lived here?
4 years.
4 years, okay. What is the worst thing about living here?
The worst thing? I can't say something worse. Like, I don't like something like there's too much traffic, but this is something that you can live with.
So you enjoyed here?
Yeah, there's nothing worse.
Okay, what are the spiritual practices in your culture? Did you practice them?
What is
Spiritual. Are you religious?
we have Orthodox church religion. We have different like Easter or Christmas when everyone goes to church and bring their Easter bread and meet the priest, and this is a thing that everyone does even if they're not very religious.
And you go to church regularly or on Sunday or sometimes?
Yes, sometimes.
How has your attitude about America changed over time?
I become more free, more happy, more smiling to people. I live in different environments and I adjust to this environment, and I'm happy about that.
So you're like Americanized, right?
Yeah.
How are elders treated in your culture? Like your grandma or grandpa?
They have respect from families, but government doesn't treat them well because the pension is small, but overall we have lots of respect. We give the best seats for them, we support, and we have.
Okay, next question. How is physical contact viewed in your culture among men and women? Are we allowed to touch? Is it like a limit?
Actually, nowadays, young people, they like to kiss each other when they see each other, but older generation, they don't really like to touch each
How
other.
about holding hands?
Yeah. For young people.
Even women and women and men and men?
Yeah.
What are the differences you see in gender roles? Like what's different between like the role
They have to work, they have to protect the family. It's like the man is in the center.
Are there some aspects of life here that you prefer in comparison to the way things happen in your home country?
I think the United States is a mix of everything.
Everything
you have everything. So there is nothing that you can invent or bring. It already exists here. So you can find some food, any country you want. You can find people, you can find connections. You can be even like here I am. Like everyone speaks Russian, so I'm enjoying it.
You feel at home. Next one, how have you been discriminated against because of your culture in America?
No,
What makes you
I don't think everyone treats me well.
So my name is Anna Osipova. and I come from St. Petersburg, Russia. I was born there and I grew up there. It is in the northwestern part of Russia. It's about 3 hours away from Finland. It's on the Baltic Sea. So that's where I come from. I came here when I was 22, and at first I came here as an exchange student. I was studying at Occidental College, and I met my future husband there, and so then I went back to Russia and finished my master's there, and then we got married and I came back. So the reason for immigration was coming here to be with my husband, and also to allow him to finish his education, because at that point I had my master's degree already and he was going to get his master's and maybe doctorate. So at that time it seems like we were taking turns. So we never thought that it would be necessarily a permanent move, but that's how it resulted to be.
What was it like back in Russia? What was like a day in the life, if you had to, just a normal day?
Well, I think within my life, there were two very clear distinctions. There was life in Soviet Union, which fell apart in '85, and then, with the coming down of Berlin Wall in '89, it was completely dissolved. And so there was life in Soviet Union, and then there were years of this very interesting time where, there was this burst of democracy, which followed in 1990s, and there was a time of, a lot of political freedom, a lot of artistic freedom, but also very difficult economic times. And then after that, I would say that Russia stepped into the time of, I would say, beginning capitalism, and that's when I left. So what life was like in Soviet Union, it was very, very stable and very predictable. You kind of knew that you were born in the city and you would spend your whole life here and die in the same bed, metaphorically speaking. But it was very predictable, very even, and as you probably know about socialist countries, things were very evenly distributed. So the salaries of all your friends' parents were very similar. You lived in small apartments, you attended a good school, and you studied a lot and studied everything about the world around you with an assumption that you'll never be able to go and see it, because Soviet Union was a very closed culture. You kind of knew that you could go and see the countries of the Soviet bloc, but you would never think about, going to America or going to England, or at least people of my, very middle class upbringing. That wasn't really possible. With the decay of the Soviet Union, as I said, the borders were open, and people became a lot more open to seeing Russians, traveling, but there was a surge of unpredictability. Lots of people had to very abruptly change their jobs. Lots of people, because that huge system of Soviet Union was no longer there, my parents, who were engineers, were no longer needed. We just didn't need this many engineers, so they had to have this very abrupt career change in their 50s, and that wasn't, anything to be desired. And but also the borders were open and we could travel anywhere and go see the world, so that was a big change. A typical day will be definitely, waking up and having a much more detailed breakfast than it is in America, with tea and coffee and, just sitting, probably, like the emphasis that people make on dinner here, like having a family dinner, and that's important here for some people. I think breakfasts there are just as important. You would wake up early to have breakfast with your family. Lots of studying. I went to school Monday through Saturday. Children in the Soviet Union had a 6-week, day. This allowed us to graduate at 16. So, at 16 I was completely done with my high school and I entered the university. That's why I had my master's at 22. And I think there was this sense of becoming an adult much earlier. When I came here as an exchange student at 18 and I was already a junior, kids were graduating from high school, and there was this big kind of, I wouldn't say disconnect, but there was a sense of, wow, they're so young still. And I'm the same age, but quite a bit older in my views and just experiences.
So you brought up a little bit about the change between the Soviet Union and then after, how it changed. What were some of the spiritual practices during that time, maybe before and after the Soviet Union?
I think that, again, I'm presenting to you the view of the Soviet Union of its very last decades, right? Because I didn't live in 50s, 60s, I very much lived in the 80s. And so, at that time, going to church, and the religion there is Russian Orthodox religion, which is a Christianity, a religion within Christianity. And, it wasn't prohibited. The churches were no longer being blown up, but at that time, and we always would celebrate, within my family, we would always celebrate the major holidays. So we would always have a really big Easter celebration. Smaller than Easter would be Christmas. That's actually a little difference that we have with, the traditions here. Because when you think about the United States and you think, Christmas and Easter, right, you would probably say that Christmas is bigger, or maybe comparable. But there I remember that, there was a lot of emphasis on Easter. And that is actually this concept of rebirth and, resurrection is like a very big construct or notion within the Russian traditional culture, So those big holidays were always celebrated. There are other traditions that were being kept. Like, for example, in June we have a Sunday which we call the Trinity Sunday, and that's when you go and remember people who passed away. So I wouldn't say that it's a Day of the Dead necessarily. It's more of a spring holiday. But what you would do is you would have branches of birch trees, and you would have them blessed, and then you would take them to the graves, and you will have a meal on a grave. That's another thing that's very important. You do bring, you bring some meal and you sit with your family and remember the people who passed. After the Soviet Union fell apart, there was this huge resurgence of religious traditions. People kind of just flocked to churches, and everybody got baptized. And I would tell you that whereas my parents were both baptized, but weren't really keeping any strict religious traditions, they didn't baptize me when I was born. But when Soviet Union fell apart and I was about 15 or 16 years old, that's when I got baptized. And that was my, my choice, and I got to choose my own godmother and all that stuff. And then, so that's in terms of, spiritual practices. So I wouldn't say that I go to church a lot. I think I go there once in a while when I kind of like feel that I need it. It's a very, in Russian Orthodox tradition, it's a very ritual-centered practice, and the services are very lavish. There's a lot of gold in the church, there are lots of icons, there's lots of singing, not music, but, not music played by a musical instrument, but everything is sung a cappella. And so I would say that sometimes I'm drawn to it. So I wouldn't say that I don't go to church, but I don't go there as often as some people do who go every Sunday. I think it's somewhere borderlines with some superstitions where, like, I would always go before a big trip. I would always go when I come back, because I go there every summer, to visit my family. I would always go and say goodbye, before I come here. But it's never something that's like an obligation for me. I'm a lot more relaxed in those practices. In terms of the question that you said, spiritual practices, I think that Russians and Europeans in general, but Russians especially, we do have a lot of superstitions. We have a lot of superstitions, and some of them are very, universal. We don't necessarily like when a black cat crosses our road, we don't do anything to the cat, but it's not a good sign. But we extend those categories, of bad luck. There's a lot of, bad luck beliefs. So you would never put your hat on the table, because that's the sign that you wouldn't have money, and all these little funny traditions that you follow. Some people more, some people less, but because I studied folklore and I studied art, those things are important.